Code Explained says hi. Today we're going to create a carousel using JavaScript. This is how our carousel looks like. Here I have a next button and the previous button here is hidden. Why? Because there is no previous slide. If I click on the next button here, the previous button shows up because now I can go to the previous slide. Also, when I reach the last slide, the next button now is hidden. Also, we have here some dots for navigation, so I can navigate to any slide I want using these dots here. So for example, I can go to the very first slide by clicking on this dot. So this is a project a beginner in JavaScript can create easily. I'm gonna go and see the HTML part, CSS and JavaScript. And also, like always, I will go and see the logic behind the code. After that, I will go and open my text editor and try to type in the code. So let's go. First, you need to know some HTML, CSS and JavaScript basics so you can follow along easily with the tutorial. It's good to know about the CSS Transform and transition properties, but if you don't worry, we will talk about them in this tutorial. Also, what you need to know in JavaScript, you need to know how to create a function, which is an object. You used the for loop before, if statements, you used an event listener, or you know what is an event listener, and also you deal before with arrays. So for the HTML part, we're going to create a basic HTML code. So inside our head here, we're going to set a title for our document. Then we're going to link both the style.css and the carousel.js files to our HTML file. So this is the one for the styling and this is the one for the JavaScript code. Then for our HTML elements, we're going to need a container. Then inside we will need a button with the class button for button and left button. So this is our previous button or left button. It's an image, so the arrow here is an image. Then a carousel container, then a carousel itself, which is a list. Then inside the li elements, for the project we have three elements, li elements. They all have the same class name, which is slide, and inside there is an image. So for example, picture one, this picture here, then the second one, then the third one. So here you see the active class name. This is not for styling, this is just for saying that this is the image that we show or that we are showing to the user. So for example, if the last image here has the class active, then this is the image we are showing to the user. Then after our carousel container, we have now the right button, which is for to go to the next slide. At the bottom here we have a nav which has three elements. They have elements, like here we have three images, so we'll have of course three devs here. They all have the same class name dot, so this is what we get here. But the first one here has an active class name. In this case here, the active class, it's not just to say that this is the active one, the active dot, it's also to add a background or a white background to our dot. Of course, when we first create our HTML elements, they won't look like this. So we still need to do some styling. So actually, when we create our HTML elements, this is what we get. So the next step, of course, is to add some code inside our style.css file. Now for the CSS, I'm not gonna talk about that in details because I will leave that until we reach the part when we type in the code. So when you finish the HTML part, this is what your carousel will look like. Then I will need to add some styling. So the first thing, I will need to change the background of the body, the container, the carousel container, the carousel itself, the slides, and the slide image, the button or the buttons, the button image, the left button and the right button, then the navigation, then the dots, and the active dot. And then I hide class name. So when I want to, for example, hide something in or some element, all I need to do is add the hide class name with JavaScript to that element. So to create the carousel, you need to do two things. First, when we created the carousel in our HTML, the carousel element and the slides inside. And before any styling, the slides were positioned vertically. And then when we set the position of our carousel to relative and the slide position to absolute, we made our or the slides were stuck on each other like this. So this is the first one, the second, and the third one. Now to create the carousel, all you need to do is to position them horizontally like this. So this is the first one, the second, and the third. And then based on the user's click, he may click the left button or the right button. After the click, all you have to do is to move the carousel. So it's simple as that. Now the question is, how can you know the exact position of every slide? So we have our carousel and all the slides are positioned relatively to the carousel. For the first one, its left side is 0. Now for the second one, its position will be here. This amount of pixels here, it's just the width of the slides, which means the second one, its left side will be 100 pixels. Then the third one will be 200 pixels. So before we go and position them, we first need to select everything. So we need to select the carousel and the slides. But what if we have many slides? For example, here we have just 3 slides. We can go and select them easily. But what if someone else uses our code and put their many slides, maybe 4 or 5 or 6, etc. So that will crash our code. So here we must find a way to select all the slides at once. So it's like selecting them all with one line of code. For the carousel, it's easy. We're going just to use the query selector. But for the slides, we're going to use a property called children. So I'm going to say carousel, this element here was selected using query selector, that children. When I put this inside my console, this is what I get. And inside, here are my slides. So this is the first slide, the second slide, the third slide. So now to select the first slide, I'm gonna just go and say carousel.children with index 0. To select the third one, I'm gonna just go and say carousel.children with index 2. But before doing that, you have to take in mind that this is not an array. This is an array-like. So I will need to use the spread expression to convert this object here or this array-like to an array. So now if I assign this to a constant called slides and take a look on the slides in my console, it says here array. So now I can handle my slides as an array. So for example, to select the first one, I'm gonna just go and say slides with index 0. with index 1 and the last with index 2. Now, don't forget why we did all of this. We did all of this just to position our slides, which means we need to know for each slide what its left side. So we have to find a relation between the left side here and the index and the width of the slide. So by thinking about that just for a little bit of time, you will find a relation. And it is like this. Left side equals the width times 1. The width is the width of the slide and 1 is just the index of that slide. Here too, its left equals width times 2. And here, its left equals width times 0. So enough talking, let's do the coding. So we need to change the left side of our slides, which means we need to change a CSS property using JavaScript. To change a CSS property using JavaScript, you will need to select the element and then use the style property here and then the property or the style property you want to change. So I'm going to say element.style.left then equals to some value here. What you have to take in mind is that you need to give a value and don't forget the unit, the pixels. So if you forget, for example, the pixels unit here, this won't work. Now, for the slides with index 0, that style at left, it's equal to the slide width times the index 0, the index of the slide, plus the pixels, because we need to use the unit here. Then for the first slide, the second slide, and so on. So you can actually define the left side of the slides doing this, but remember, again, what if we have more than 3 slides? So we have to do this in a way that can define the left side of all the slides. So we said that this is the index of the slide. Then I'm gonna say here I for the index and also here. So the slides with the index I, that style at left, is given by the slide width times its I or its index plus the unit pixels. Now I need to do this for all the slides, which means I need to use a for loop. I'm gonna loop over all the slides inside my array slides. So I'm gonna start from 0 till the slide's that length. Then I will put this inside a function called position slides. Why I need to create a function here is when someone comes later and see my code, when he finds the name position the slides, he will know exactly what this code will do. The position slides will take in 2 parameters, the slides, the array, and then the slide width, the width of the slide. So let's now talk about the slide width. So the width of the slide might change. If the window of the browser changes, the width of the slide will change also, which means we need to calculate the width of the slide. So I'm gonna go and create a constant called slide width, which is equal to the slides with index 0, and here I'm gonna be using a method called getBoundingClientRect. When I take a look on that in my console, and by the way, this is a good way to find out what a method does or a property. So if I say slides with index 0 that getBoundingClientRect, I will get these properties: the bottom, the height, the left, the right, the top, width, x and y. So now for us we want the width property. So to get to the bottom, for example, what I need to say dot getBoundingClientRect dot width or dot bottom dot height, etc. For us, we're going to say dot width, and then I will need to call the function position slides, because this is just the definition. Then when I call the function here position slides, this will position all the slides horizontally. Let's talk about the transform property. So when you go and search for transform, you will find this definition. Transform allows you to rotate, scale, move, skew, etc. the elements, move or translate. So in our case, we need to move our carousel. So we're not going to use rotate or scale or anything else. So we're going just to move or translate our carousel. So I will give you an example. Let's say we have an element here, our carousel, for example. We need to move our carousel to the right. If we say transform, translate x, 100 pixels. So we say translate x, this is the x-axis. So if we want to move our box here vertically, we need to use translate y. But in this case, we need to move our cursor vertically to the right or to the left. We're going to use translate x. So in general, if we add this code inside our style for this box here, if we say transform translate x with 100 pixels, this will move our box by 100 pixels from its origin position. But instead, if we say transform translate x minus this time 100 pixels, this will move our box to the left by 100 pixels. So you know now how to move our carousel. We're going just to use the transform property using translate x and 100 pixels or a value. The question now is the value. Is this value? What is this value? How can we calculate this value? How can we know the exact value with we will move our carousel? So let's see an example here. So we have here our carousel, right? So we have now previous slide. So we'll go into the next slide here. So the next slide is this one. So we need to take the left side of our next slide to this position here, which means we need to move our carousel by this amount here, right? So I will repeat that. We will need to move our carousel or to move our next slide left side from this position here to this position here, which means we need to move our carousel to the left by this amount, right? This amount here is known. We know this by next slide. This is our element. Let's say slides with index 1. So this is the slides with index 0, index or slides with index 1 or slides with index 2, etc. So I'm just gonna call this next slide and previous slide. So the next slide, that styled left, is this amount. So when I click on the left button or the previous button, the carousel must translate by this amount here. To translate the carousel, we will need to set this amount here or this value here to a variable called position, so to give more meaning. So now we need to translate our carousel to this position here. So I'm gonna say transform translate x minus position. You already know I use a minus here because I want to take my box here to the left, so the carousel must move to the left. Now let's talk about the transition property. So the definition is, transition allows you to change the property values smoothly over a given duration. Right, so the keywords are change the value of some properties smoothly based on some duration you give. Let's see an example. Let's say I have a div. an element. The width is 100 pixels. The height is 100 pixels. So this is my div here. I didn't say the background color. We're not talking about the color for now. So then I want, when I hover over my div element here, I want its width to change by 500 pixels. Using this code here, just this code, if I hover, this will change immediately, not smoothly, but immediately the width of my element div to 500 pixels. From 100 pixels, the value of the property width from 100 pixels to 500 pixels immediately. So how to move from 100 pixels for the width smoothly from 100 pixels to 500 pixels. So this is where our transition property takes place. But instead, if I say transition 1 second with linear, in this case, if I hover over my div element, this will change its width from 100 pixels to 500 pixels smoothly, and it will take 1 second. Cool, let's talk about these properties. So there are of course a lot of properties, but the ones we will need in this project are just 3. The first one is the transition duration, which could be given in seconds or milliseconds. I suggest using milliseconds. Then the width here is the transition property. It could be any property, the width, the height, the transform property, etc. So for us, we're going to be using the transition on the transform property. Then the last one is what we call the transition timing function. So you can see here this animation to know what we are talking about. So here, this face here, this egg here moves with no ease, moves linear from here to here, but here it's different. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the transition timing function might be linear, ease in, ease out, or both ease in and out, etc. Now, the overflow property, which you might already know, the overflow specifies what should happen if content overflow an element's box. For example, you have some box here, an element, and then your text overflows that element. When you use the overflow property in your CSS code, what do you want to do? Do you want to make it visible? So even when the text goes beyond the elements, you want it to still be visible. But instead, if you say overflow hidden, everything that goes or that overflows your element, it will be hidden. So this is what will be shown to the user. So in our case, we need to use the overflow. Why? Because when we positioned our slides horizontally, actually the user will see the first, the second, and the third. He will see all the slides. But for us, we need to show just the active slide, which means we need to hide all the others, which means we need to use or to add this line of code to our carousel container. So for our carousel container, we will hide all the content that overflows our carousel container. So now that you know how to do the animation, the question is, how do we select the active slide, the next slide, and the previous slide using JavaScript? So for example, if we have these slides here inside our carousel, then how do we know where is the active slide? So we said before that the active slide has a class name called active. So it's really simple to select that active slide. So in this case, I'm just gonna go and create a constant called current slide. So this is the slide that we are showing to the user, and it has a class name which is the active. So I'm going to say carousel.querySelector.active. So inside the whole carousel, the only element that has the active slide here is the current slide. So simple. Now for the next slide, here is the next slide and here is the previous slide. So to select the next and the previous slide, we need to take a look on our current slide object. So if I open my console and take a look in the active slide and then scroll a little bit down, then I will find here some properties. For example, the next element sibling. So the next element sibling here simply is our next slide. And also here, if I scroll down a little bit further, then I will find previous element sibling, which is our previous slide. So simply to select the next slide and the previous slide, for example here, I'm just gonna go and say next slide equals the current slide, which is I selected using only query selector. Then I'm gonna say next or dot next element sibling. Same thing for the previous slide. I'm gonna say previous slide equals the current slide dot previous element sibling. Now to go, for example, or to move our carousel, I'm gonna say just position equal next slide dot start at left, and our position equals previous slide dot start at left. So here is when we click on the next button, and here is when we click on the previous button. Then simply I'm gonna use JavaScript to change the transform property or the style of our carousel. Then I'm gonna say carousel.style.transform equals translate x minus position. So in general now, what we need to do is when we click on the next button, we need to know the current slide, or select the current slide, select the next slide, calculate the position, then move the carousel or translate the carousel. And when we click on the left button or the previous button, we need to select the current slide and to know or select the previous slide, then calculate the position and move the carousel to that position, which means we have here separate codes, one for the next button and one for the left button. Now this is our carousel, this is the next button or the right button, and this is the left button. So here the right button has this class name, so we need to know when the user clicks on this button, which means we need to add an event listener to our document. We need to listen to the user's actions. Here we need first to select our button here. I'm going to use query selector. Then after selecting our next button, then we will add an event listener to that button. So whenever the user clicks on the next button, this will fire up this anonymous function. So inside this function here, we said we need to select the current slide, which has the active class name, and then select the next slide using the property next element sibling. Then after I know the next slide, I need to know the position here, or this amount here, which is given by next.slide.left. And then I will change the transform property of our carousel here to translate x by minus position. So here this is not a single code, this is actually a backtick. So I'm using here a lateral expression. So now if I click on the right button, my carousel will move to the left. So something here will get your attention. It is that the one or the current slide or the old current slide is no more the active slide, and our old next slide is now the active slide. So we need to move the active slide from the current slide, the old current slide, to the old next slide, which means we need to toggle the active slide between the current slide and the next slide. How do we do that using code? We're going just to go and say current slide dot class list. So the class list here will return an array that has all the class names of our current slide element. Then I'm going to use the remove method that will remove the active slide from the class list. And also for the next slide, I'm going to use the class list method that will return, we said, a list of classes of our next slide. And then I will use the add method that will add the active slide to the next slide element. So here it's like toggling the active slide between the current slide and the next slide element. Okay, this is the code for the next button. Now let's talk about the previous button. So for the previous button, we also need to select the button like we did here. Then I need to select the previous button using the query selector again. The left button here is the class name of our left button. Then I'm going to add an event listener to the previous button. Then inside we said we need to know or to select the current slide using query selector. Then the previous element sibling will return or will select the previous slide element. And also we need to calculate the position of the previous slide. And after that, I will just change the transform or update the transform property of our carousel. Again, we need to toggle the active slide between the current slide and the previous slide. And now our code here will work just fine. The only problem here is that these 4 lines of code are much the same as ones. So when you have a repeated code, means you need a function. I'm gonna call the function move to slide. The parameters of our function here are the variables that will change in these 4 lines of code. So the variables that will change are the next slide, the carousel, and the current slide. So I'm going to say move to slide, the carousel, and then the current slide, and the target slide. The target slide here might be the previous slide or the next slide. So inside our function, we need to calculate the position. So here, I'm not going to say next slide or previous slide, I'm going to say target slide. Then the carousel.startTransform, we will change transform property here. And now for toggling the active class from the current slide to the next slide or to the previous slide, looks like we need a function for that. So a function that will do the job of toggling. So I'm gonna go and create a function called toggle active from the current slide to the target slide. So I'm gonna go and say current for here, our parameter, current class list, remove the active class, and then target class list, add the active class. And here I will simply say toggle active the current slide here and target slide. So let's now update this code here. So we created a function that'll take in these parameters: move to slide, the carousel, the current slide, and the target slide. Now for our carousel, when we click on the previous button, we need to know the current slide and the previous slide, and then simply we use the function move to slide, which takes in the carousel, the current slide, and then the target slide here is the previous slide. Same for the next button. So I'm going to say or select the current slide, then the next slide, and then use the move to slide function, which takes in here the carousel and the current slide and the next slide. Now let's talk about hiding the previous and the next button. So, for example, in this case, I can go to the next slide and also I can go to the previous slide, which means I need to show to the user the previous button or the left button and the right button. But for example, if the user clicked on the next button here, we will be in this state, which means there's no next slide, which means we need to hide the next button in this case. And also, if he clicked the left button instead, we will be in this case, which means there's no previous slide, also means there is no left button. Now, this is simple. If it's the very first slide, then we need to hide the left button. But if it's the very last slide, then we need to hide the next button. But if it's either the last slide nor the first slide, then we need to show both the next and the left or the previous buttons. So in terms of code, I'm gonna go and use an if statement, and I will say if the target slide. So I'm talking about the target slide. So we need to check if this is the first slide or the last slide before we go to that slide. So for example, if we are in this state, the user clicks on the previous button, we don't need to check the current slide, but we need to check the previous slide. So this is what we call a target slide. So here, if the target slide is the first slide, so the first slide, its index is 0. In this case, we need to hide the left button, but we need to show the right button. And also here, if the target slide is the last slide, how do we know the index of the last slide? It's not 2. Here, it's always 0 for the first slide, but for the last slide, it will change. Now, if we have an array with some elements, we have here 3 elements. If we say array.length, then this will return 3 because we have here 3 elements. But the index of these elements are like this. The first element, its index is 0, and the last element, its index is 2. So we can figure out the index of the last element based on the array.length. So here, we're just gonna say array.length -1. So always the index of the last element of an array is given by the array.length -1. So here I'm gonna say if target slide is the slides with index slides that length -1. In this case, we need to hide the right button and show the left button. But else, if none of this is true, we need to show both the buttons. Now to hide buttons, we need to go inside our style.css file and add some styling to a class name called hide. And set display property to none. So whenever I add the hide class name to an element, this will make it hidden. Now in JavaScript, I'm gonna go and use our if statements here. So if target slide equals slides 0, the first slide, then I will need to hide the left button, which means I will need to add to the class list of the previous button the class name hide. And I will need to show the right button, which means in this case I need to remove the hide class name from the class list of the next button. And here also, if it's the last slide, I need to show the previous button but hide the next button. Else, if none of these is true, we need to show both of them, which means remove the hide class name from both the previous button and the next button. Now, as I will need to reuse this code, I will put this inside a function called hide button that will take in 2 parameters: the target slide, which might be the previous slide and the next slide, and also the slides. Now this is the second update for our previous and next buttons code. So this is how our code looks like. Now, just after the move to slide function here, or line of code, we will add the hide button function. The target slide, in this case, it's the next slide, and our slides array. And also for the previous button, just after the move to slide, we will hide the buttons, and in this case, the target slide is the previous slide. Okay, now we've got to the part where when I click, for example, on the third dot, I must go to the third slide. So, what we already know is this is my navigation div with the class name nav, and here every dot here has a class name which is dot, and the one that's active has the class name active. Okay, now the user, or inside our navigation, we might have as many dots as we want, which means it's not a good idea to go and select every dot like using query selector or anything else. So to select the dots here, all I need to do is the same as we did to select the slides. So I'm gonna go and select the navigation. We have only one navigation, so I'm gonna select it using query selector. And then to select the dots, I'm gonna go and say nav.children, and then convert this to a real array, because nav.children is an array, like it's not an array. So now if I go and take a look on my object dots inside my console, this is what I will get. The first dot with index 0, the second with index 1, the third or the last one with the index 2, as I have here only 3 dots. Now this is an array and its length is 3. Cool. Now on the other hand, we have our slides. It's also an array that has the same length as my dots here. Actually, my first slide here has an index 0, and also this one here has the same index. So every dot here is linked to the exact slide in my slides array. So the idea here, if I click, for example, on this dot here, all I need to know is its index. If I know its index, then I can go easily to the exact slide. So for example, if I click on the dot with the index 2, which is this one for example, then I need simply to go to the slides with index 2, which is this one here. So simple. The question here is, how do I know the index of the clicked dot? It's simple. So I'm going to use a for loop to loop over my dots. So I'm going to loop over all the dots one by one and check if the dot I clicked, if the one I clicked is the dots with the index I. So for example here, if I clicked on a dot, then I will need to go and check if the clicked dot is the first one, then the index is 0. If it's the second one, then the index is 1, and so on. So here, if the dot is the dots with index I, if this is true, then I will return I, the index of the dot I clicked on. Now to make this code functional, I'm gonna go and say instead of dots, items, because sometimes I will need to go and search for the index or find the index of a given slide, and sometimes I will need to go and find the index of a given dot. That's why I said here items. So items, the item might be the dot or the slide. So I'm gonna say then if the item is the items with the index I. If that's true, then return the right index. Then I will put this inside a function called findIndex. So if I want to find the index of a dot or a slide, all I have to go and say is find the index or find index of the dot or slide inside the dot or the slides array. Cool. Now the question is, how do I know the clicked dot? So if I click on this dot or this one, how do I know the exact clicked dot using JavaScript? So this is our navigation, which is a div with the class name nav, and then inside I have my dots. Now I will simply go and add an event listener to my navigation, which is on click. Whenever I click on the navigation element, this will fire up a function that takes in an event. E stands for event. The event here is the click event. If I click on navigation and take a look on the event on my console, this is what I will get. If I click here, for example, in this area here, the click event here is an object that has many properties. One of them is target. If I click on the navigation here, it says target dev.nav. It means that I clicked on a dev with the class name nav. If I clicked, for example, on this dot here, and I take a look on my event in my console log, the target here says you clicked on a button that has the class name dot and a class name active. If I click, for example, on one of these dots instead, the target will say button dot dot, no active class here. So this way, using the target property here, I will know the exact element I clicked inside my navigation. So the target dot here is given by e.target. Now that I know the click dot, all I have to know is its index. That way I can go to the exact slide or to the right slide. So here I'm gonna go and search or find the index of the target dot inside my array dots. I'm gonna put this or assign that to a variable called target.index. Now the target slide is given by slides with index target.index. The target dot and the target slide have the same index. Now I will need to use my function move to slide that will take in the carousel and the current slide and the target slide. Here is my target slide. Now I need to select the current slide. It's easy. I'm just gonna go and use query selector to select my active slide or the current slide. Then I need to hide the button, so I want to hide the previous and the next buttons. And also I need to toggle the active class from the current dot to the target dot. So for example, if I click on the last dot here, I will need to hide the button, right? And also show the previous button. And also I will need to take the active class name from this one to the last one. So toggle active will do that for us. Now the target dot is selected using e.target. To select the current dot, I'm going to use same line here, except I'm going to say nav that query selector that active. Now one last thing is I only want this code to run only if I clicked on a dot, because there is the possibility to click on the navigation element. So I will go and say if e.target is the navigation, then return. If it's not the navigation, then it's a dot, then run this code here. So return here or make the function exit from this line. Now the last update for our previous and next buttons code. So let's say this is our carousel and this is the active dot. If I click, for example, on the previous button, I must toggle the active class name from this dot here to this dot here. So if I click on the previous button, this must be the active or the new active dot. How do I do that using code? Simply, I will go and use the toggle active from the current dot to the target dot. The current dot is known by the active class name. So I will go and simply select this element here using query selector. Now I need to know the target dot. To know the target dot, I need simply to know the previous slide index. I already selected the previous slide using the previous element sibling property, so I will just go and create a new variable called previous slide index, and then I will use my function find index of the previous slide inside my slides array. So this way I will know the index of my previous slide. Now to select the target dot, I will simply go and create constant target dot equals the dots array with index previous slide index. The same goes for the next button. I'm gonna toggle the active class. I need to select the current dot. I need to select the target dot using the next slide index, which I will know using the find index function. Now these 4 lines here are the same as these ones, which means it's better to use a function here. So I'm gonna go and say slide index. So the slide index might be the next or the previous slide. Then select the current dot, then the target dot, and then toggle the active class name. I put this inside the function called move to dot, which takes in the target slide, the slides, the navigation, and the dots. So for here, I will simply say move to dot. The target slide is the previous slide, the slides, the navigation, and the dots. And here, I will simply say move to dot. Target slide is the next slide, the slides, the navigation, and the dots. And this way, our carousel code is completed. Now that you know the logic behind the code of a carousel in JavaScript, you can go and type in the code by yourself. If you still need some help doing that, I will now go and type in the code step by step. But before doing that, if you are not already subscribed, please hit the red button and also the bell to get notified about every new video. So let's go now and open our text editors. So if you want to follow the tutorial step by step, you will need to go to the repo, and you'll find the link in the description. Click on the link and then go to the repos and find the Carousel JavaScript. Then you need to download the repo, and after that, inside the files or inside the zip file, you'll find the files for the project, the whole project, and also a folder that says starter template, and that's what we need. So I will go and rename this. So the name is Carousel. I'll go and open my text editor, and of course I'm gonna open a folder which is in the desktop. Then for files, you'll find inside the carousel with the starter template are the images, the left arrow, and SVG, the picture 1, picture 2, picture 3 for the slides, and right arrow, the carousel.js, index.html, and style.css. Let's start with index.html. I'm gonna create a very basic HTML template, and then I'm gonna change the title to Carousel in JavaScript. I will try to open this or live preview. So I'm gonna go live preview of the document. So I will create a container, a div with the class container, then the button with the class button for button, then another class name which is left button. So this is the code for the left button, then the image left arrow svg, and then after that it's the carousel container, and inside the list with the class name carousel, and then the li elements with the class name slide. Inside the slide it's an image. I'm gonna copy this 3 more times. This is picture 2, picture 3. So if I save and refresh, I'm gonna see the images positioned vertically. Now after the carousel container, it's the next button or the right button. Inside it's the same as the left button, it's an image, the right arrow. Then after that it's the navigation or the dots. So I'm gonna create 3 dots because I have 3 slides. I'm gonna add the active class name to say this is the one we are showing to the user. So now I'm going to link the style sheet to the HTML file. So let's now go to the style.css file and add some styling. So the background color for the body it's black. Now for the container, I'm gonna set the width to 80%, so to make it responsive, the height to 400 pixels, margin 0 auto to center it, and position to relative. Then the carousel container, its width is 100% of the container's width. The height is also 400 pixels, and the position is relative. Then the carousel itself, the list here, so the padding 0, the margin also 0, and the list style is none. Now for the slide, for the li elements, the padding and the margin also set to 0, the position is absolute, and the width is 100%, and also the height is 100%. Now if I refresh, you can see that the images or the slides stuck on each other. Now for the images inside the slide or the li elements, I'm gonna set the width and the height. Now if I go and change the window width, you can see that the images stretch. So I'm gonna change that using or fix that using the object fit property and set it to cover. Now for the buttons, I'm gonna set the position to absolute. Then to center them vertically, I'm gonna use top 50%. And to width center them, I will use or set the height for now to 100 pixels. Then use the transform property to translate the Y by -50%. This way I will center well the buttons. Now for the background is transparent, and I will get rid of the borders, set them to none, and in the cursor to pointer to give the feeling that it's clickable. Now I'm gonna add the style for the images, so both the width and the height are set to 20 pixels. Now you can see the image. Then the style for the left button, so I'm gonna just change the left property and set it to -35 pixels. Now for the right button, its right is set to -35 pixels. Now I'm gonna style the navigation. So we're gonna see the background color just to see what's happening. Then the width to 100% of the container, and the height 30 pixels. Then the position absolute, top 400 pixels. Then the nav button, so the buttons or the dots inside. So I'm going to set the background to an RGBA, so a black with or a white color with a 0.3 opacity. Then the borders to none, the width 5 pixels, the height 15 pixels, and then the border radius to give them round shape. The border radius is set to 50%. Something's wrong, so okay, here I said dev, not buttons. So I'm gonna go and change this to dot. The width now is set to 15 pixels. The margin 10 pixels. The cursor pointer. Display flex, and then center the content. I'm going to use justify content center. So I don't like the margins, top margin. I'm going to get rid of the background. Now for the active one, I'm going to just set the background opacity to 1. Now later on we need to hide some elements, so I'm gonna add a class name with the style display none. So if I add this to an element, that will make it hidden. So by default the left button is hidden, so we can't go to the previous slide because there is any. Now for the JavaScript code, the first thing always is to select the elements. So I'm gonna select the carousel using the query selector method. Then I will console log the carousel.children because we need to select all the slides at once. So it's not working, so I forgot to link the script file. So now you can see here that I have selected the slides, but I will need to change or to convert the array like to a real array. I'm gonna assign this to slides. So we just selected all the slides inside the carousel. Now for to position the slides horizontally, we will need to change the left property of every slide. So for the first one is 0, the second is slide width plus pixel, the unit. Don't forget that, or this code won't work for you. First, I will need to calculate the slide width using the get bounding client rect method. So if I console log the slide width now, you can see that the property width. So I will just need to say that width, and I will get the width. So if I change now and refresh, you can see that the width of my of the images or the slides changes also. So here for the last one, it's slide width times 2 plus pixel. So like now you can see that the slides are positioned horizontally. Now we said before that there is a relation between the slide width, the index of the slide, and its left position. So I'm gonna change this to index and also this one here. So if you know the index of the slide, you will know its left side. So I'm gonna go and loop over all the slides array and change every slide left side or left position. Now I'm gonna copy this inside. If I refresh, I will get the same results. Now to make our code more readable, I'm gonna use a function called position slides. So whenever someone read that, he will know what's the code for. Now I'm gonna call the function position slides, and the code works just fine. I'm gonna add a comment here to say it's position the slides horizontally. So now I'm going to select the next button or the right button using query selector. And then I will add an event listener to listen to the user's click. And if the user clicks on the right button, we move the carousel to the left, or we say we translate the carousel. Next button dot add event listener click. If it clicks on the button, we run a function, an anonymous function. I will first need to select the current slide using the query selector, and it's known by the active class name. Now if I console log the current slide, nothing shows up because I need to click on the button first. Now if I take a look inside the element or the current slide and scroll down, I will find something we need, the next element sibling. So the next element sibling is the next slide. So I can select the one or the next slide using the property next element sibling. So I'll copy this and say const next slide equals the current slide that next element sibling. That's easy. So if I console log the current slide and next slide on the click, you can see that I selected the slides successfully. Now I will need to calculate the position of the next slide, so I will know for sure where to move or to translate my carousel using the transform property. So I'm gonna translate x, the x position of the carousel, to the position. Now if I click, you can see that I am moving, but it stacks because I still need to toggle the class name, the active class name, from the current slide to the next slide. So the current slide, the current slide is now the previous slide, and the alt current slide is now the next slide. Oh, there's a problem. So here I must say next slide, not next button. So now if I click again, it's really working. So I will need to add some transitions to the carousel. So transition 300 milliseconds, transform property, and the easen for the timing function. Now you can see the transition. Now I will need to do the same thing for the previous button. I will go first and select the left button. So I'm going to say const previous button, document.query selector, and left button. I will go and just copy this code here, the whole code. I'm going to see here left and right. Now here we say previous, current slide, here previous slide, and previous element sibling. Here we're gonna say previous slide, also here previous slide. If I save, I'm gonna remove this for now. So here, okay, I will need to set the overflow property of our carousel container to hidden. So overflow is set to hidden to hide everything that overflows our container or the carousel container. So now if I can go to the right, and also I can go back to the left. If I click here, I can get an error. So to fix that, we'll just need to hide the button right. But let's first create a function called move to slide. So move to slide function will move this slide. So I'm gonna say here target slide, because the target slide might be the next slide or the previous slide. Our move to slide function will take in as parameters the carousel, the current slide, and target slide. So here I must say target slide, and then here we'll just say move to slide, carousel, current slide, next slide, and here I will just say carousel, current slide, and previous slide for the target slide. Next slide is not defined, so inside the function, oh yeah, here I have to say previous or target slide. Now if I check that, I can see that it's working. Now I will need a function for toggling the active class between the current slide and the target slide. So this function here will take in as parameters the current and the target. So I'm going to say current and here target. Now I will just need to say toggle active between the current slide and the target slide. Current is not defined. Okay, so here I need to say current slide, not just current, and also target slide. So that's cool. Now let's hide the buttons. So when I reach the last one, I have to hide the next button. So I will go and create a function called hide button. So if the target slide is the first slide. In this case, if the target slide is the first slide, then the left button must be hidden. And of course, the right button must be shown. So here I'm gonna use I have to see previous button here and next button. So previous button is the element we selected, class list.add height. That way we will make the previous button hidden. And for the next button, I'm going to use remove. That way I will show up the next button. So if the target slide is the last slide, the index of the last slide is given by slides.length -1. So here, if the target slide is the last, then the next button is hidden and the previous button must be shown. Just the opposite here. So I'm going to see here next and previous here. Now else, if none is true, if we are in the middle, then we show both the previous button and the next button. Now for the parameters on the target slide and the slides array. Now I'm gonna go and add this just right after the move to slide. So target slide here is the previous slide and the slides, and here the target slide is the next slide and the slides array. Let's go now to our HTML and hide the left button. So now if I click on the next button, you can see that the previous button has shown. Now when I get to the last one, the right button is hidden. So the code is working just fine. Now let's do the coding for the dots or for the navigation panel. First thing is I will need to select all the navigation and all the dots like we did selecting the carousel and the slides. So I will go and console log the nav.children. So here you can see again I have an array with all the dots inside. I will need to convert this to an array. So I'm going to use the spread syntax. Assign this to a constant called dots. That way I'm selecting all the dots. Now just at the bottom here I will add an event listener to my navigation, which is the click event, and this will fire up a function that will take in an event, the click event. So if I console log the event here, you can see here the target. So it says that I clicked on the dot active. I clicked on the dot. I clicked on a dot. So you can know which element you clicked using the target property here. So I'm gonna set this to call a constant called target dot. Now I will need to find the index of the dot I clicked so we can target the right slide. So for that I will create a function called find index. I will find an item inside an array that has all the items inside. So I will need a full loop to loop over all the items and try to compare every item with my item, and if there is a match I will return the index. It's easy. Now let's go back to my function, or inside my function. So let index equals find index of the target dot inside the dots array. I will console log the index. So now this has 0, 1, 2, 1, 2, 0. So now the target slide is given by the slides with the index. So I'm gonna rename this. I'm gonna say target dot index. Now let's use the move to slide to move to the target slide. So the move to slide will take in the current slide, which we need to select. So we need to select the target or the current slide. Sorry. So the current slide is inside the carousel and it has the active class name. So let's check that, and now you can see that it's working. That's cool. Now we need to move the active class name from the current dot to the next or to target dot using the same way we did with the current slide and the target slide. I'm gonna change this to uppercase. We need first to select the current dot, using the query selector method. So now if I click, you can see that the active class is toggled. Now we need to hide also the buttons, which takes in the target slide and the slides array. So now you can see that the buttons are shown. Here the next button is hidden, and here the left button is hidden. One more thing is that we need this code to run only if we clicked on a dot. So if we click on the navigation, we say return. So we exit from the function. So if I click now, you cannot see any error like before. So it only works when I click on the dots. Now we need to move the active class when I click on the buttons. So here I'm gonna need to select or to find out the slide index using the find index function we created before. Now we can select the current dot using the query selector, and the target slide or the target dot is selected using dots that takes in the slide index, and then toggle active, current dot, and target dot. So you can see that it's working, but with the previous button now. So I will take this and put this inside the function called move to dot, and here it will take in the target slide and the slides, the navigation and the dots. So here I will say target slide, and that's it. Yep. So I will go and change this to move to dot. It will take in the target slide, which is the next slide, the slides, the nav, and the dots. So it's working. Now I will need to go inside the previous button code. Let's check that, and it's working. So I think this is the end of our tutorial. Now let's say if someone used many slides rather than 3. So I'm gonna copy this 6 times. If I save and refresh, you can see 6 dots. Let's see if I can move the slides or the right slides using the buttons or the dots and also the buttons. So this is working just fine. So I want to thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you liked it. If you do, like the video. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe, and see you in the next tutorial.